Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Fly. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the US, currently based in Berlin. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our event, which we've titled Expecting the Unexpected, Election Day in America. There's obviously a lot of speculation about various post-election scenarios, the potential for the questioning of the results and legal maneuvers related to electors and other issues related to the election. Many of us are old enough to remember that these are not new topics in American politics. This did not all start with Donald Trump. American, especially presidential politics, every 4 years has had debates about poll watchers, voter fraud. There have been legal challenges over voter access. But obviously this cycle, everything is under heightened scrutiny, and it's been a unique conversation about a number of these issues. We also have foreign and domestic actors that are trying to use some of these issues to raise questions about the validity of the election and the sanctity of everyone's vote. I would also note, given where I sit in Berlin and given GMF's transatlantic focus, that this US debate this year comes when American politics is under heightened scrutiny overseas. And sitting here in Germany, I've already seen a number of pieces looking at the potential for certain post-election scenarios and the implications on America's standing in the world and on the alliance. So we felt that this was an important conversation. We have a great group of experts to discuss these issues. The conversation is going to be moderated by a longtime friend of mine, Katie Biber, whose day job is as Chief Legal Officer at a fintech startup called Brex, but she has longstanding experience in this realm, most notably serving as general counsel to Romney for president in 2012. So she's well suited to moderate this conversation. So Katie, I'll hand it over to you to get things going.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks in advance to all of our panelists. I know this is going to be a great conversation. Welcome also to our audience. We have an impressive audience today spanning across Europe and the United States. And I have it on good authority that there's a big group of San Francisco middle school students who got up early because this has little something to do with the unit they're working on. So welcome to them too. All right, let's get started with the introductions. Ben Ginsburg, who is a mentor of mine, is the nation's most prominent expert, I think, in political and election law. In 2000, he led the Bush campaign's legal strategy during the disputed Florida recount. From the moment the Florida election result looked uncertain on election night to the moment George W. Bush was sworn in as president. He has counseled 4 of the last 6 Republican presidential nominees and thousands of other participants in the US political process. He also served, I think this is right, Ben, as co-chair of the Obama administration's bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
Josh Geltzer is the founding executive director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, as well as a visiting professor of law at Georgetown. Josh, I believe you served from 2015 to 2017. Pardon me, I'm going to tell you guys a little secret. I took something that was behind me and ran across the house with it so that I could get it out of camera view. So I'm a little bit out of breath right now. Geltzer served from 2015 to 2017 as the senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council staff, having previously served as deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council and as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security at US Department of Justice. As will become, I think, a little bit relevant later, he also clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Stephen Breyer. All right, before we begin, I am supposed to mention that there is a chat box down below. Please submit your questions and we'll be getting to those later on in the conversation. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Joshua, why don't we start off with some basic mechanics about how the US elects its presidents? The most defining feature of the US electoral system, of course, is the Electoral College, but there's a lot of other wonky pieces of the US election system that could give rise to strange occurrences on election night and thereafter. Can you tell us a little bit about the rules and processes that make the US election system a little bit unique and unpredictable?
Absolutely will, and I will do it nice and slowly to give you a chance to catch your breath, Katie, but I will also say thanks to you, to Jamie, to Derek Chalet, to everyone at German Marshall Fund who helped pull this together. And thanks to Ben. It's a real treat to get to do this with you, Ben, and I'm looking forward to it. And thanks to folks who've tuned in, especially bright and early on the West Coast of the US. So, Katie, let me just take a moment to maybe trace the process, because what starts on November 3 is itself a process. And I think distinctive about that process, maybe at least two features. One, the interaction between the state and the federal, and two, just how many stages there are to that process. Other countries don't have things quite as convoluted as we do, at least in some respects. So to lay it out real quickly, the next big date to think of after voting ends on November 3rd is December 8. That's a date you'll hear referred to as safe harbor. And it means that Congress, right, the federal Congress, has pledged to respect how any state resolves a dispute over which candidate gets that state's votes in the Electoral College, so long as they resolve it under rules that already existed and by that date. That's safe harbor. The next date to think about 6 days later is December 14. That's when the electors, the members of the Electoral College, meet in the several states. US Constitution says it has to be the same day for all the states, and federal law sets the particular date. Move from that to December 23. That's a date where if the Senate and the archivists, now we're moving from the state to the Electoral College to Washington, in a sense, to the federal level. If they haven't gotten from states a slate of electors, they're supposed to say, where is it? Figure out where those votes from states that are missing, in a sense, are. And then fast forwarding a bit, really big date is January 6th. That's when a joint session of Congress, meaning the House and the Senate, presided over by the president of the Senate, the vice president, this year it'll be Vice President Pence, gathers. It's the new Congress, which will have been sworn in 3 days earlier, and they open these slates of electors that come from the states, and they work through any disputes that persist at that point, like whether to count a particular state's slate or whether to count one of multiple slates that may come from a state. So I'll leave it there, but I hope that sets a little bit of a useful timeline and shows the interconnectedness of states, which can resolve or try to resolve disputes under state law at the state level, and the role of the federal government.
Thank you, Josh. That gave me just enough time to catch my breath. Also, before I get to the next question, I want to tell a very relevant story about Ben Ginsberg. This is a little bit unfair to Josh because I have known Ben for a number of years now. And I want to tell a story about the week of Election Day in 2000. I think Ben knows exactly which story I'm going to tell. It was the Monday before the election, and Ben and a number of the members of the legal team of the Bush campaign were out to lunch at a Mexican restaurant in Austin. And they got on the subject of whether or not there might ever be a recount in presidential politics. And Ben stated rather famously and emphatically that there would never again be a recount in presidential politics. And of course, 48 hours later, one started that he helmed on behalf of the Bush campaign. So Ben, my question for you is, take us behind closed doors. What's going on right now on the Trump and Biden campaigns as they prepare for some of the potential issues that Josh just described?
Well, Katie, thanks very much for telling that story. It does go to the broad overall point that you can never predict what's going to happen with elections, despite a lot of conventional wisdom being talked about. And let me add my thanks to the German Marshall Fund for putting this together, and to you, Katie, for moderating it. And Josh, it's a great pleasure to be on this panel with you. So right now, the two campaigns are taking a look at how they will operate in 4 distinct periods of the election. There's the pre-election period. That's when voting starts. And that has already started in most jurisdictions in terms of early voting and absentee voting. The second phase to look at is Election Day, when the bulk of votes will actually be cast in precinct upon precinct around the United States. The third stage will be election night, when the votes are actually counted. And night is sort of a euphemistic term in this case, and could be much later than just Tuesday night. And then the fourth stage is what Josh very succinctly and correctly referred to in terms of the overtime period. So the campaigns are worrying now about how they staff it. Do they have enough people to monitor what's happening as the ballots are cast both early and election day? Will they decide, will they see instances of fraud or irregularities that come up in the post-election in dispute resolution in the counties? Election night is always kind of a wild time to keep track of the ballots as they're tabulated. So they're looking for both lawyers and civilians to be able to be part of the counting and casting in the many jurisdictions in the U.S.
So we'll be getting to the concept of poll watchers in just a moment, but I want to shift gears slightly and go back to Joshua and ask a little bit about the Supreme Court. Obviously, it's in the news this morning. Amy Coney Barrett just cleared the Senate Judiciary Committee after the Senate Democrats on the committee all protested the vote. But Josh, tell us a little bit about, for our European audience especially, what is the role of the Supreme Court likely to be in all of this? How does this nomination that's currently pending play into the discussion?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and helpful to clarify, because sometimes, at least this cycle, one hears the notion of, will this election be decided by the Supreme Court? And in a sense, it doesn't work that way. It certainly doesn't work that way in the sense of the Supreme Court writ large taking an election that seems close or fraught or disputed and picking a winner. Now, what can happen, and what did happen in 2000, for example, is that the disputes over what should be going on in a particular state, and especially if it's an outcome determinative state, that dispute can work its way through the court system, most likely the state court system, though not necessarily, but the state court system, and ultimately get to the US Supreme Court, assuming there's a matter of federal law there rather than just a matter of state law. Whether that happens depends in part on the actual vote, whether the margin is close enough, whether the showing that must be made can be made as to, for example, a push for a recount or an argument that there shouldn't be a recount. It's also at least conceivable that other issues could be litigated, or at least that one campaigner or the other could try to get them into court, although there would be arguments that they shouldn't be there. For example, as Congress sits down in January, if there's really still a dispute then, there could be interesting arguments about Congress is not handling its resolution of this correctly. There'd be arguments on the other side saying it's assigned to Congress by the Constitution and the court doesn't play a role. But in any of these imagined circumstances, I think that the real takeaway is it's not just here's the election, Supreme Court, sort it out. Instead, it's a particular legal issue that, if there's enough merit to it, might make its way all the way to the court. And of course, to a court that seems almost certain to have a new justice on it. But nonetheless, to have its role as a decider of law, not of politics, ultimately.
Yeah, so speaking of that new justice, a number of the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee pressed Judge Barrett in her hearing about whether or not she would recuse herself from any election-related case. I guess the first question is, should she? And through what framework should she make the decision about whether to recuse?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that, though I'd love to hear Ben's thoughts as well. The recusal standards are less than scientific or mathematical, which of course leads to disputes at times.
Which is why they were pressing her, obviously.
Right, it's what leads to questions in the first place. Now, I'll say my own sensibility is a president who has said, I think rather unfortunately, I want a new justice. In fact, I want this new justice on the court in time to resolve election disputes in which I, President Trump, am a candidate. That doesn't feel quite right to me. I suspect it may not feel quite right to Judge Barrett. It certainly didn't feel right to some of the senators who were asking her about it. And it would seem that the legitimacy of the court and whatever decision they might be asked to render in an election-related case, especially an election outcome determining case, that the legitimacy would be a lot higher if she didn't partake in that. again, especially, it's not even just the timing, it's those particular comments from the president nominating her. So my sense is one would want to err on the side of recusal because the president has essentially said, I want her there to decide this election for me. But I'd be curious for Ben's take as well.
Oh, don't worry. I have a follow-up question for Ben too. I do think it's interesting. I think Chief Justice Roberts will certainly have the court's legacy on his mind as the court decides any election case. But Ben, I want to twist this question a little bit for you and talk about 2000. Because, the court received a lot of flack following the Bush v. Gore decision in 2000. How was that dispute different than the types of disputes we might expect this time? And what happened in it for those not familiar?
Well, we are likely to see very different sorts of disputes, which is why under the standards where each justice decides for himself or herself whether they're going to recuse, I find it hard to believe that she would not participate in a case that will probably be one of first impression. And I think that there may be a lot of talk from people who fear how she would vote in that case, but that will not stop her from participating. And so while the court did get considerable flack, the court felt and stated that it needed to step in to deal with the chaos that it feared from going past the time frames that Josh mentioned in his introduction. And so I think no matter how the court may get a lot of criticism for jumping into an election case, it will see part of its institutional role if the proper case is presented to it as needing to step in to stop chaos and have a peaceful transfer of power on January 20th.
Yeah, one thing that has made 2020, I think, especially different from 2000 is the big questions that we're discussing about the overall trustworthiness and efficacy of our voting systems. These were present a little bit in 2000, but now, we have people discussing whether or not Donald Trump would voluntarily leave the White House in the event of losing. And Josh, this is a big sociological, perhaps psychological question. How did we get here? How do we get to the point where we're having these conversations about whether or not we can trust our government institutions?
Well, I guess in some ways we got here because Donald Trump has said things that I really wish he hadn't said and that I think other candidates have not said. And that goes back to him as a candidate, right? When he was asked at one of the debates in 2016 about whether he'd accept the legitimacy of an election that he appeared to have lost, he declined, and he's given answers to similar questions that tend to be concerning this cycle. But I also think it's worth emphasizing as we link up this important question, Katie, with the one about how the court might be involved, that there are really hard questions about election law in this country, what the Electoral Count Act means and how it directs Congress to resolve disputed ballots. I mean, people have gotten tenure for saying how complicated it is that they can't figure out an answer to this late 19th century statute.
I think tenure has come from lesser things as well, but do go on.
That is also true. So, but I want to distinguish that in some ways as hard questions, interesting, fascinating, from the ones that the pseudo-legal things that President Trump has been talking about, right? When he says mail-in ballots kind of writ large can't be trusted, as Ben pointed out in an absolutely critical, I think, piece that he wrote for the Washington Post, there's just no basis for that. Or when President Trump says we need to know the winner on election night, otherwise there are questions about the legitimacy. That's not a legal argument. That's just a statement, and it's an erroneous statement. So I do think it's worth teasing apart the conceivable hard, complex legal questions from what we're hearing right now, which they do confuse the public square. And I think there could be real damage from people who believe him, and we can talk about that, but they shouldn't be hard questions in court, for example.
Yeah, so these hard, complex questions you talk about, they actually start with really mundane nuts and bolts issues, due dates, types of ballots that different states have, the requirements of the Constitution. Ben, can you talk us through some of these very nuts and bolts issues? What should we be watching for on election night? What are some of the very key dates in this process going to be?
Well, election night, and really in the lead up to election night, is Josh correctly mentioned that President Trump is talking about the system in a way no one else has. And it is one thing to talk in broad generalities about an election being fraudulent or rigged, and very different to be able to actually bring that case in a granular, precinct by precinct, state by state way. Each state has its own set of rules and timetables for how they count ballots and how they resolve disputes afterwards. So this election is going to be hallmarked by the pandemic and the result that there are far more absentee ballots being cast and therefore to be counted, which could slow down the tabulation of results in some states. It's true also that we're a very polarized nation. And so what you want to look for on election day is how the count is actually being conducted. If the Trump campaign is to take the president's broad charges of fraudulent elections and put it into play in those different state contest and recount procedures, they will have to amass the evidence in the pre-election voting and then on election day. So I think that what you want to look for the most is how smoothly voting goes. And are there systemic challenges to individual voters from the Trump campaign? And then just to go back to the 2000 question a second, Katie, remember that 2000 was one outcome determinative state that was remarkably close. That does not usually happen. That's why people make predictions on the Monday before Election Day about why we'll never see a recount. But to put it in context, of the 57 presidential elections the US has held, only 3 and maybe 4, depending on how you feel about 1800 and the Electoral College, only 3 of those 57 times has there gone to a dispute, either because of the closeness of an election or allegations of fraud. So let's put the chances of that happening at about 5.2%. But the place it all starts off is how smoothly the ballots are cast and counted.
All right, we just have a couple more prepared questions. I would love to see some additional questions popping up in the chat, so please feel free to start there. But changing gears a little bit, we've talked a little bit, Josh, about problems with election administration, self-inflicted wounds that our system may impose upon itself. Do we worry at all, or do you worry at all about actual foreign interference, hacking, and things like that into the US election system?
So when I think about foreign interference with our elections, I tend to think about it in 2 categories. One being threats to data integrity and one being threats to discourse integrity. So by data integrity, I mean actual changing of voter rolls, actual
And that's
changing.
the scary stuff right there, yeah.
That's right. And that's what we didn't see so far as we know in 2016. It gave us reason to worry, but we didn't see. Then discourse integrity, I tend to think about what's on social media, what conversations are happening, what claims are being made that the Pope endorsed one candidate, as a famous social media content circulated widely in 2016 claiming, or whether the right day to vote is Wednesday, which of course would be too late to vote. And that's the threat we did see emerge in 2016 and which we see continuing. Indeed, we had some cabinet officials announce Iranian and Russian efforts along these lines just last night at a press conference. And so I guess I worry ultimately that the data integrity question is a big one, because if we really did see that sort of threat manifest itself, it would yield confusion and problems and quite a lot of concern. But in some ways, I'm more focused on the one that's actually here, the discourse integrity, because that's the one that's unfolding. And I think it's where there have been some steps taken since 2016 to strengthen our digital infrastructure, in a sense, maybe more our cognitive infrastructure, to try to help people anticipate and not fall prey to disinformation. We still see it circulating more widely than I think many of us would like, and people being taken in by it. But that's the threat, I guess, that's already here in a sense.
Very true. All right, let's move into a lightning round. I can't mute you like in presidential debates, but I can tell you have 15 seconds to answer each of these lightning round questions. All right, you guys ready? Question 1, and we'll start with Ben. What US state is most likely to cause a problem in the year 2020?
I'm going to give you 3. Wisconsin,
no. Okay, I will allow you 3, Ben.
Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Probably Pennsylvania because it's going to be a key state, and they don't start counting their absentee ballots, processing their absentee ballots until election day. So it will be put back. Georgia, because there is a fickle finger of recount fate, and they also are likely to have a runoff U.S. Senate election.
Yeah, they have a messy Senate situation right now.
And the second most counties in the country. So a recount there would be really, really terrible. And if there's a sense of humor amongst the gods, look to that.
Okay, Josh?
Ben made better use of my time than I would have, but I think Pennsylvania, because of its centrality and because of that fact that the mail-in ballots, which, as you say, we expect to be quite understandably higher this year in a pandemic, don't start getting counted there, unlike some other states, until we actually hit election day.
Okay, we'll start with you on the second one. Will we have an electoral college tie, yes or no?
I think no. I think no for 2 reasons, quickly. One, historically, these things are very rare, just as Ben put it. And 2, the polls right now, I know we've all been chasing the not to trust polls after 2016, although the polls have been adjusted since 2016, but the polls right now don't point in that direction.
All right, Ben?
Yeah, I
Hopefully
agree.
this won't become a story
Josh
too.
said it well.
Okay. All right, starting with you, Ben, again this time. If an election case goes to the Supreme Court, what will be the issue?
2 possibilities. One is the Electoral Count Act, which Josh mentioned and which no mortal can figure out what it really means. The second is equal protection. Remember that there are 10,500 separate jurisdictions in this country that count votes. You do not get consistency between that many jurisdictions in a state. And if there is a recount or a contest, an equal protection case is likely.
All right, starting with you, Ben, this time. In 2000, Americans learned about some wonky Florida ballot printing. They learned the definition of a Chad. What is the issue they're going to learn about this time?
Postmarks in the U.S. Postal Service.
That's a good one. Josh?
I think that is a good one. I'll also add the idea of mail-in, of drop-off, of curbside. I mean, all of this people had some rough sense of, but the combination of the pandemic and the intensity of feelings about this election have driven all of that home. In fact, I'll cheat for a second and say those are the issues that have already, in a sense, gone to the Supreme Court about this election. Not on full briefing, instead on this stay posture where the court is deciding whether or not to intervene with a lower court's decision. But those have already gone to the US Supreme Court in a sense.
All right, final lightning round question, and then I'm going to start looking to the audience questions. Josh, by what day will we know who the next president is? And this is being recorded, so we will throw this in your face in about 3 weeks.
Look, I know that you expose even Ben's private conversations after the fact of his predictions, so I'm on the hook regardless. I think we'll know within a week of November 3rd, based on the polls as we have them, based on the preparations, including for an onslaught of mail-in ballots. I think in the public sensibility, we will know within a week of November 3rd.
I believe that we will actually have a really good indication on election night being defined as the wee morning hours. We will, but there will not be an official call that soon to be able to see what else is up. But by Friday, November 6th, there will be an answer.
All right. Well, we'll come back to this reporting in a few weeks and just see who was closest. But
great.
Let's look at some of the Q&A that's coming up in the chat. So this is a question from Derek, and this is for either of you. Could you give us your view on the recent court decisions on allowing mail-in votes to arrive after November 3rd in Pennsylvania and North Carolina?
Would you like to start, Ben?
Well, you should also throw in
Yeah.
Wisconsin and Michigan in
That's
that.
right.
So the court, I believe, is referring and deferring to properly elected local officials or administration officials making that decision. The court in Pennsylvania was dealing with a state Supreme Court ruling, which gets really complicated. The U.S. Supreme Court overrides the state Supreme Court, which is why I think you had a 4-4 decision helping the Democrats. North Carolina was a court of appeals that got a little bit into the policy making, and the Supreme Court deferred back to the back to the legislative proponent. I think that's where you're going to end up in the other two states.
And I'll use maybe the Pennsylvania case as an excuse to go back to this theme of the complex interplay of state and federal, because the state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania thought it was deciding, acted like it was deciding issues of Pennsylvania state law. 4-3, the dissenting justices generally disagreed with how to read an interplay of different Pennsylvania laws. And then as the case was taken by the losing side of the Supreme Court, of course, there needed to be an argument that there was some federal law issue. That's what the US Supreme Court weighs in on. And they said, well, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court essentially violated federal law about having a single election day, if at least it's conceivably possible that a ballot mailed the day after could go through the mail so quickly as still to be counted within 3 days. And they said, moreover, the court's doing this when the Constitution says legislatures do that. Now, the counter argument to that was this was their best attempt to effectuate a single election day. And it was an interplay of Pennsylvania state laws, regardless. Whatever the court was doing, it thought it was doing it on the mandate of the state legislature. And of course, you get a 4-4 split. Presumably the 4 who would have granted the stay, who would have halted that ruling, thought that there was a federal law issue there. And what all of this amounts to is it's complicated. These questions of of what is the state law province and where the Constitution and other federal law has bite or constrains what states can do is really complicated. And that in some ways, figuring out what is the state and what is the federal prerogative, that almost is the argument in some of these cases.
So we have a great question from a student here in San Francisco that I've gotten to know pretty well this semester. And Dylan's question is, why is there an electoral college in the first place? Doesn't it seem kind of anti-democratic? Wouldn't it be easier and wouldn't we save more money if we didn't have an electoral college? I'm sure many members of our audience from Europe are asking themselves the same question. So I will toss that out to you.
Josh, that's your area for the.
Oh, that's buck passing if I ever saw it, Ben. So I do think, there is growing at least focus on this, in part because we've now had 2 elections in a 20-year period where the winner of the popular vote was not the winner of the electoral college vote, and therefore not the winner because the rules are as they are. So the history is complicated. I do think there's this sense of a mediated democracy that plays into that history, and a sense of having a transition between those who vote and those who actually get the final say. But at this point, it doesn't play that role, right? We saw a couple of electoral college representatives, I believe 10 in 2016, not cast the vote for the candidate they were assigned to cast it for, didn't change the result. And yet that was historically an aberrant. That made the electoral college, in a sense, have real bite, but not enough to change the result. And of course, the Supreme Court recently told us all that if a state wants to bar or punish faithless electors, those who don't cast the vote they're supposed to cast, states under the federal Constitution have prerogative to do so. So, there are those who are working to try to change it in various interesting ways, including this compact among states that if it reached a sufficient number would in effect eliminate the electoral college, even if it formally left it in place. I think folks are going to see that issue crop up more if there continues to be a winner or winners of the electoral college vote who are not the popular vote winners, because it certainly makes the disparity salient for the country. But whether that continues to happen or not, I guess we'll all continue to see.
Well, the electoral college stems from the roots of the country, where the founders needed to strike a compromise between more urban interests and more rural agricultural interests. And so the idea was that the cities, the urban areas, even back in the late 1700s, would have far more power over the agrarian interests if it was a straight up popular vote. And so the compromise between urban and rural transfers today. I mean, the main argument for keeping the electoral college is that if this was a strict popular vote, you would have the election run solely in the big cities, and that rural interests and maybe even exurban and suburban interests would never get talked about, because it would just be a pure number of the masses, and where they live the most is the only place candidates would show up and campaign. If you look at President Trump's travel schedule, you'll see him going to a lot of not heavily populated areas. And that's a sign that that need for the compromise still exists today.
So we've gotten a lot of interest in the chat in voter intimidation, poll watching, voter fraud. And I'd love to direct this question to you, Ben, because you actually recently wrote a very heavily read op-ed that talked about how the Republican Party has overly focused on the concept of voter fraud over the years, and perhaps has overhyped the existence of such a thing, and has maybe even used it as a tool for things like voter intimidation. So can you tell us a little bit about what you see going on in the field right now? What is the Trump campaign doing that may be different from more traditional Republican voter observation organization? And then tell us a little bit more about your op-ed.
Well, I'd approach it from a little bit of a different historical perspective. Ever since the days of the Tammany Hall big city machines, there have been reports of voter fraud, of sort of fake votes being cast. And that suspicion about fraud takes root in precincts where one party votes overwhelmingly than the other. If you go back and look at the presidential election results, there are a number of precincts around the country that vote 80-20, 90-10, 95-5 for one party or the other. And so suspicions rise in those precincts that something is amiss. Part of what each state in the country permits is for the candidates and political parties to have poll watchers in polling places to look for and report incidents of what they think are fraud or irregularities. And that's important to always do. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party do that. It is important to have validators, as permitted by each state law, in any polling place they want to be sure that the results are accurate and there's nothing amiss going on. So that the principle of having poll watchers, which is what the Republican Party is certainly engaged in, is a positive virtue for accurate results that lead to the peaceful transfer of power. What is different about this election cycle is what the president is saying, that the elections are fraudulent and rigged. I've been in the precincts or run the hotlines to report incidents and frauds for the last 38 years. And there are isolated incidents, to be sure, that come up, but not in those 38 years is there anything close to the evidence to be able to say that there's systemic fraud involving elections so that they're rendered rigged. So the Trump rhetoric is what's different about this election cycle, and which I think is actually harmful to the basic democratic institutions to make the country work, which is why I wrote the op-ed. Now, if you're the Trump campaign, if you really want to contest this election, you're going to have to take the president's rhetoric and put it into action. That will occur if poll watchers and election observers this year, who are allowed to be in the polling places, who are properly registered with the party or the state, start filing lots of challenges to voters. And that will be categorically different. And that will lead to the sort of culmination of the rhetorical barrage that the elections are fraudulent and rigged.
Yeah, very right. And one of the things I appreciated, Ben, about your op-ed is that it's very consistent with everything you've said behind closed doors in the many years that I've known you. No one will ever accuse Ben Ginsburg of flip-flopping or being inconsistent. I think for a very long time, you have been one of the few voices drawing attention to the fact that this is an overhyped problem, and one that the Republican Party sometimes uses as a cudgel for less than savory acts. Slightly lighter question, I guess. How do you both think that potential contested Senate races will figure into the equation of confusion following the election?
Well, I suppose that would be if there is an outcome determinative presidential state
Right.
and there is a tight Senate race at the same time. That has not happened in our history. It would be as if there was a recount in the Florida Senate race.
Careful with the predictions
2000.
here.
Yeah, that would be a really difficult situation, and the result would be that it would throw into doubt Josh's timeline on the Electoral College. For Senate races, there's certainly incidents where senators are asked to stand aside pending a recount, and Senate seats go unfilled as of January 3rd when the Senate convenes.
So there's a great kind of broadly philosophical question I just spotted in the chat. What is the purpose of voter registration? I mean, it's a very fair question to ask. I'll toss this to either one of you.
Josh,
It is a deeply philosophical question, and there are countries. I'm no comparative election law expert, but there are countries that handle this differently. Where, as I understand it, once one is of appropriate voting age, or once one becomes a citizen, if one is of age but on the pathway to citizenship, one is essentially registered as a voter. Now, it's still incumbent on that person to go ahead and make use of that privilege and responsibility to go ahead and vote, but there isn't that threshold step of registering as a voter. And I think there have been advocates in the United States of taking a similar approach of saying there's essentially a burden on entry, even if it seems minimal, even if states, some of them make it relatively easy to register, some don't, but some do and have tried to make it easier still. There's essentially a burden on entry, and in particular, the timelines associated with registering can create a problem, because sometimes life is hard and people are busy, and people realize an election is coming up only as it's approaching, and the idea of getting registered and then being eligible to vote in time for that election that has made voting something that one is focused on can have passed already. So you do hear conversations about that. I don't think that we're likely to see a dramatic overhaul anytime soon, and instead the probably more feasible or realistic push, even if it's maybe a lower ambition push, is to try to make registration itself something that people are aware of, that they're aware of the timeline, and something that they're able to do without it being a big burden.
Well, the purpose of registration in this country is to be sure that the voters are eligible to vote in the elections for which they're actually casting ballots. And that's a function of a couple of things in this country. It's not so much the presidential election, where in fact, anyone who's a citizen of the country can vote in the presidential election. But the United States electoral system, one of its hallmarks is that there are many, 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 many very local races. And so you want to be sure the people who live in a city council ward or a school board ward are actually people who live in that jurisdiction. And so the registration of voters serves that function, to be sure that it really much more on a local level than the national or statewide level. Just to get down to the mechanisms of the political parties, the parties have always seen advantages in registration simply in terms of resources. You want to be able to talk to your voters, to be able to get your supporters to come out to the polls. If everybody is registered, then the campaigning and activities in terms of get out the vote and participation gets really diffused and really expensive the way that we do it, so that the parties have also benefited from having more defined lists of who the voters are, who they need to contact to get them out to vote.
Yes, Ben, you mentioned, oh, go on, Josh,
as a footnote to that, Ben's great articulation of it makes me realize that perhaps a better way to frame it is, I don't think it's a debate of registering versus not registering. It's really registering versus auto-registering, right? I mean, I think countries that have a system that asks less of the voter than ours does, they're still registering. They're just, in a sense, auto-registering for the person rather than making the person take an affirmative step to do it. And as Ben says, at some point you need that, right? You need to know are you in this city or this county and therefore voting in this race versus in that city or that county and voting in that. So we do need to know who's voting where and their eligibility for that. So I realize in hearing Ben's good response that the formulation is probably better as auto registration versus affirmative registration rather than registration versus none, because none would make one think that you just need to sort it out on election day who gets to vote in what. And of course, that's not a feasible or manageable system.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
to put a
and
finer
to be
point,
clear,
Ben,
a
on what
number
you,
of states have gone to same-day registration.
right.
So anyone who feels the urge to vote doesn't have to be pre-registered. They can walk in on election day in a number of states.
Right, and to put a finer point on what you said, Ben, about local requirements for local races, for those not aware, there are lots of different requirements that states and localities have on the different types of voters who can vote in different types of races. For instance, here in San Francisco, there's an initiative on the ballot that would permit 16-year-olds to start voting in local elections. Obviously, that's not something that would be permitted at the presidential level, but it shows that each requirement is hard to federalize because of the way the Constitution mandates we run elections. So we're getting several questions about electoral college reform, and would love to hear you all touch on whether you think this is something that actually may take root or if this is just going to be forgotten after the chaos of 2020.
Well, I think it may take root if there is an overwhelming Democratic majority of over 60 senators, so that it can get jammed through. I mean, again, the compromise between urban and not urban interests is the reason behind the Electoral College. I mean, I think it's significant that the talk of Electoral College reform rises and falls exponentially to who's in power. When one party thinks that it sort of got gypped out of elections it should have won, all of a sudden it's the Electoral College's fault. But the Electoral College provides rules of the game. Changing the Electoral College is actually the equivalent of saying we're not going to pretend in a football game who scored the most points. We want to change it to who got the most yards, because that's a fairer way to do it. Or who wins on the basis of the number of penalty kicks as opposed to goals scored for real football fans.
I mean, the Electoral College makes very clear that the rules dictate the winner, and how you measure success dictates who wins the race. It's a fascinating conceptual question. I mean, Josh, what do you think about this? How do you think these conversations about reform will look in another 10 or 15 years? I'm going to ask for more predictions because they're very interesting.
So one thing that I think is important to emphasize is what a seismic shift, not just in the counting, but in how campaigns run, it would mean to get rid of the Electoral College.
Huge,
and
massive change, absolutely.
Enormous change. I may be a little bit rosier on that change than it sounds like Ben is, but that's because there are a complex set of factors. Ben is surely right in terms of where attention gets paid because of the current system. I also look at where attention doesn't get paid because of the current system, including in some really, really big states that basically aren't up for grabs or seem perennially not up for grabs. And I would in some ways like to see more attention paid to them. But I think we'd all agree it's a seismic shift, and it's worth understanding that it's not just a different addition at the end. Instead, it changes where dollars would flow, where candidates would spend time, where votes would, in a sense, matter more and matter less. I guess I certainly agree with Ben that the political outcomes of 2020 will affect where this conversation goes. I also think the outcomes of a few more presidential elections will affect it. I did see some statistical studies, I don't know their validity, after 2016, suggesting that based on demographic and voting trends, this idea of the popular vote and the Electoral College vote not yielding the same outcome is likely to increase over time. But of course, that's in the abstract. It depends a lot, like who one candidate is and who the other candidate is and what the American people think of those candidates. So these things are not, totally statistically determined ahead of time. If that divergence continues, it will certainly keep the issue salient. Whether that will combine with the type of at least possibility because of political power, as Ben says, to go ahead with the massive project of amending the US Constitution. Whether that'll be there, I think it's hard to say.
Yeah, and a close cousin of this conversation about the Electoral College is the conversation about the United States Senate and whether or not it's fair or equitable that Wyoming has the same number of senators as New York or California. How do you see this working its way through the collective political world?
I think if the Democrats win the Senate, the conversation goes off the table because they're happy.
That's practically true, I think. Josh?
I think that's probably right. And I also think that these conversations are important and they're fascinating. As you can tell, the three of us are enjoying them and the questions reflect that. At the same time, I see a country that has lots of challenges, in a sense, more urgent than structural. I mean, structural challenges have their own urgency, but we have a pandemic raging and we have national security challenges and we have economic disparity. And so there's only so much bandwidth for whoever it is who finds themselves with some allocation of political power in January. And it would seem to me that there's going to be, and I hope there will be, a lot of effort put into addressing some of the things that I just articulated and worry about, and that I think deserves more attention from our federal government and in some cases from other governments as well. And the idea, to my mind, that that will somehow be put on the back burner while very ambitious structural reform to something like the Electoral College or the Senate gets considered, it strikes me as unlikely, and it strikes me as probably not where things need to be. Instead, we need to stop the number of Americans who are dying each day from a deadly virus. That probably needs to come first.
So one of the other interesting questions we've received is about accusations that the Trump campaign has been trying to discourage Black voters from voting in key districts. Do you see things like discouragement of voting, voter suppression, to be a significant issue? And I'll direct this one at Ben because it's a little bit of the flip side of what you were talking about in your op-ed.
Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder on a lot of the messages. I think that a message to one person's partisans that says, your candidate is not really so good on the issues you care about, is in one sense information the voters should have that can be sort of interpreted as voter suppression. You're trying to get people not to support that particular candidate because it helps whoever was saying it get out voters. So I think that we've not really come to grips as a country with the impact of social media being able to influence individuals with very tailored messages. And that's part of what this is. So I'm not sure it's voter suppression to point out the flaws in your opponent on issues that that person should care about.
Josh?
This may be taking in some ways lower hanging fruit and addressing an easier issue, but the thing that worries me is this endorsement. I'm not even sure it's implicit at this point. It's really become explicit for those who are not, as Ben laid out so well, not the people who've worked through the state law requirements to become poll watchers, election observers, and play what is an important role, but instead this encouragement to just come out and just be at or around the polls and just see what's going on there, because that is not a legitimate role in our system. And it's even more worrisome when you hear the president talk about a white supremacist or otherwise violent extremist group as a group that has any business operating, frankly, in this country, let alone operating with anything to do with polls or election day or voting. And so what I would love to see is a return to a consensus that whatever one thinks of the candidates, the idea of going to the polls is one that should be done with total comfort, with total trust in one's own personal security, with total comfort that the people whom one encounters won't inhibit the casting of a free and fair vote, whomever it is you want to vote for. And I know there are a lot of state and local officials who are working hard to try to ensure that does happen this cycle. And I very much believe it will. But I would love to see the rhetoric from all candidates and those around them get back to encouraging exactly that.
Josh raises an important point, and he's absolutely right. In terms of the nitty gritty, it's important to remember that to be a poll watcher, you need to be registered with the state or the party, so that an individual who either just wants to watch or wants to cause trouble can't just go into the polling place to create disruptions. Every state has a law against voter intimidation, and every state has sort of a ring of safety around the polling place, usually 100 feet, in which there can't be overt political activity, and certainly not voter intimidation. So the actual polling place itself does have an enforcement mechanism for bad acts not to take place. The more worrisome part are demonstrations outside of polling places beyond the safety zone, the 100 feet, that are disruptive. And then what does local law enforcement do about that, and how do polling officials handle it? And do voters decide not to vote because of that? And that rhetoric should be cooled down. And if it occurs on election day, it should absolutely be reported and exposed.
So I think this will be
I
the
will put
last.
in, Katie, just a very quick plug, if you'll let
Please,
me.
yes.
My colleagues and I at Georgetown's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection have prepared 2-page fact sheets on exactly the sort of laws Ben mentioned, on what to do if you're a voter and you do see something that you at least think looks like a private militia, an unlawful type of entity there that you think is intimidating or suppressing votes. And it has an election voter protection hotline to call. It indicates that one should contact law enforcement if one is really worried about imminent violence or threats of harm. And so I would just encourage folks, if they're interested, go to our website. There's a drop-down menu, pick your state, and you can see exactly what the laws are and what to do if there's reason to worry about it.
So last question for both of you. On election day, there's likely to be just a gushing fire hose of news coming at people from Twitter and just the internet generally about poll watching and long election lines and problems with election administration. I'd love for you to tell us, what can we tune out as just sheer noise, and what is going to actually be an important set of facts that voters should pay attention to on election day?
Well, I'll be on CNN if I can put in a plug, and I hope you'll all be watching as we sort through that. So having done election day operations for a while, it's important to look for patterns as opposed to individual incidents. What is true about poll watchers and election protection people and everybody else who is involved in the process, they tend to be very over-caffeinated on election day, so that individual incidents in individual polling places can flare up. But what you need to look for are patterns. We do have many jurisdictions. They are, for the most part, run by volunteers. It is a very human system that we have in the United States for the casting and counting of ballots. Mistakes will happen, machines will break down. That doesn't mean the elections are fraudulent and rigged. So look for the patterns of activity that rise to a big level, as opposed to breathless reports of one incident.
So don't hyperventilate. Everything's going to be all right. Is that what you're telling us? I hope so.
Well, I'm not saying everything will necessarily be all right, but it is important not to overreact to the breathless and to look for the larger patterns.
Absolutely. Josh.
I think that's beautifully said. And, I have the pleasure of serving with some other folks on this National Task Force on Election Crises that we stood up because this year is so challenging, to try to disseminate real information. And we have on our website things about what the law really is. And I particularly worry about people using social media to spread ideas like election day should now be postponed, which of course the president alone has no authority to do, or the state legislature is just going to swoop in and override the public vote, which we think there are real legal problems with. And so I think voices like Ben on CNN and like others who've been through this and who see, just as he says, the broad trends rather than the particular incidents, I think that's crucial, because social media is really designed for the micro, right? To take a 12-second clip that may look really awful, and that can go viral quite quickly. But in fact, if 4 seconds later, someone peaceably took care of that group that appeared to be blocking the entrance to a poll, those 4 seconds are probably more important than whatever preceded it. If it was resolved peaceably and quickly and ultimately didn't stop anyone from doing what we want them to do, which is cast a vote of their choice. So I think all of us, frankly, doing our part not to get consumed by the micro, and in fact, zooming out and trying to share at a macro level what I hope will be a day of impassioned, but peaceful and successful and orderly voting. I think that's something all of us, frankly, can contribute to.
Yes. Well, on that message of calm, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Josh, and Jamie and the German Marshall Fund. Thank you for putting this event together. It was a very enjoyable conversation. And I wish everyone a wonderful day and a peaceful and mentally healthy election day.
Thanks, Katie.